Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Elisabeth Walden. I'm here with the Oregon Potters Association at their showcase at the Oregon Convention Center. I am gonna do a little demonstration today showing you how I make my hand-built Fat Babe planters. I have a few examples to show y'all before we get started. I'm going to start today with my basic process for making the little ones. So for those of you who are familiar with ceramics, these are actually just pinch pots. Not really anything other than that. I will show you sort of the whole process of how I make them, but if you've ever taken a ceramics class, you usually start with this, like just a lump of clay in your hand and you pinch a little shape. So you can take it, you can make a cup or you can make something like this, which is a little bit more complicated if you are patient. So I'll start with the clay I've got here. I've got two different clay bodies that I'm going to wedge together. I buy all my clay at Georgie's because we're lucky enough to have such a wonderful resource here in town. And these are actually their clays. So this is their trail mix dark chocolate, which is a beautiful, rich, dark brown color, which I do sometimes use on its own, but I find is nice mixed with a lighter clay. So what I have here is just their Timberline Sculptural clay, which has a lot more grog and grit in it. So especially if I'm working larger, this scale, bigger, a little bit more sort of add some structure to the clay, helps you sort of hold your shape as you go. Because the dark chocolate is a pretty fine-bodied clay, nice and smooth and plastic. Really a joy to work with. So I'm going to start now by wedging them together, which will require a bit of effort. Some people do this to make like nice, beautiful agate ware or spiral clays. I just like to have a little bit of a lighter color to my clay because it helps the finishes on the surface show up. And also to add that structure like I was talking about before. So I'm just slicing my clay into strips to start the wedging process and sort of bang, forceful. Alternate them. And this is probably, I could try to start wedging all this by itself, but I think I'm going to cut it in half and do half at a time. Just to save my back and arm and side muscles. All right. Half at a time. So let's see how much I can talk while I do this. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm not actually a trained ceramicist. I've taken workshops here and there. But I have an MFA in printmaking, whole different field, but also very process-based. But in grad school, I took a ceramics class and really liked it, and sort of got started taking workshops when I lived back on the East Coast, and found that I was working a lot with sort of self-portraiture and images of my body in printmaking, but found working in clay to be really sort of freed me from a more sort of strict one-way thinking about trying to make meaning in my work. And so I started just making these lumpy fat forms, and then eventually discovered that you could stick a plant in them, and that was exciting. And then I started showing them to people, and people were interested in them and occasionally wanted to buy them, which was certainly more than had ever happened for me very often with my prints. So I've just been sort of teaching myself and finding studio space where I can for the last 7 or 8 years. I moved to Portland in that time. Great clay community out here. So many potters, as you can see, surrounding you. Okay, so that's half wedged up. You can see here. You can still see the sort of spiral of the different colors in the clay. I'm going to keep going because I want it to be one solid sort of color before I start. And this is just your basic sort of ram's head spiral wedging. Everyone has their own sort of technique for it, but I just like to rock gently back and forth and let my body weight sort of press the clay down. I don't know if any of y'all ever make bread, but pretty similar process to kneading that. We're getting there. It also helps make the clay nice and pliable and not quite so so wet, which will help when we get to the building process. So I think I'm going to show you a few different kinds of techniques today. I'll start with sort of the basic pinch pot technique, and I'll get as far as I can. The process doesn't take that many hands-on hours, especially for a small one, but you do have to stop and let it dry in between as you sort of shape, because you try to work it too much at one time, it starts to get weak, and then it collapses on you, which has happened to me more than a few times. All right, here we go. So that's looking really nice. Let's cut it open and make sure. Yeah, so now we've got sort of one color of clay, one clay body. It will be pretty close to this color when finished, which this now has lots of fingerprints on it. I have to wash that later. Maybe a little lighter depending on what washes I use on the end. So, okay. Well, the next thing to do is decide how big I want to try and go with this piece. I think I'll start with a little one. And then we'll work on some larger pieces, coil build things, and play with slabs and stuff. All right. Cool. So got a nice shape. If I were going to try to make a bitty one like this, start with, it winds up to be about 1 pound of clay once it's fired, so it's probably between 1 and 2 pounds of clay when it's wet. I haven't actually measured it, but small piece. Wedge it a little bit more, just to start to get it into a kind of shape I want to start with. Here we go. So you hold it with one hand and sort of press down with your whole body weight, but controlled through your wrist. I'm just folding this until, all right. Got the basis of a cylindrical sort of shape. I can fit my hand around it very comfortably. This is a good size for a small pinch pot. I'll bring the ends in, and then I just usually, before I get started, just sort of whack it into shape, like whack in all the edges and smooth out the outside with my hands, or sometimes on the table, around a little bit like this. Like, just bring all the clay together. Try to eliminate any air pockets that might be hiding there. All right, here's a good place to start. And now that I'm done wedging, I'm going to sit down and ruin all the good work that our cameraman just did, trying to get me centered. Sorry. Okay. So, lump of clay, pinch pot, pretty dry. I'm going to put a little bit of water on my hands. That's maybe even a bit too much. And take your finger, stick it down the center. Not complicated, very intuitive. Now the part that is tricky about this for making a pinch pot, if you've ever tried to make one before, is to try and keep it even, the thickness even all the way around. And I will say that that is very much a matter of practice. So what you can't see is a lot of the work that's going on inside right now is my thumb gently pressing outwards against my hand and trying to make some space inside, give me some basic volume to this form. Pressing, and I also do some sort of like some smoothing motions like this with my thumb as I pull outwards. There's a lot more clay up at the top than at the bottom to start, because I can pull that up as I go. So how wide it's going to be is sort of pretty much determined at this point, because I'm pushing outwards until I feel like it's about the right thickness. And I'm going to start thick because as I go, there's a lot of smoothing and sort of working with my hands on the surface that tends to thin things out. So I maybe, in the initial form, I'm probably aiming for about 1/4 of an inch thick to 1/2 an inch thick, somewhere in there. And then it'll get thinner as I go. But now I'm sort of just pulling upwards gently on the lip with my thumb to get some height to this. All right. Now, usually they're going to be wider at the base than they are at the top. So now I can stick 2 hands in there. You can see, got your basic hole, 2 fingers, I should say, not 2 hands. So I'll switch to working with 2 fingers at a time, just gently smoothing and pulling out. Push, push, push against your hand. If you don't do it against your hand, boop, you're likely to just like rip a hole right in the side. So you want to. But that's actually at this stage pretty easy to fix. So I'm holding it there and letting the clay body become one again and smoothing on both sides. Making sure to give lots of pressure to make sure that there are no little air bubbles in there. But because this clay is all nice and one even even dryness, you don't need to worry about like reattaching things. They should just go right back together. But that spot is now thin where I stuck my finger through. So I want to try to avoid that while I continue to sort of gently press out the back. So I'm going to aim for the bottom to be wider than the top, which you can see is starting to happen. As I just push, push, push. Now at the base of this, I've probably got definitely more like no thicker than 1/4 of an inch most of the way around. And like you just have to develop your feel for like with your hands, like how do you know how far apart your hands are if they're not touching? And like you have something in between them. I don't know, it's a part of your brain that as you use it more gets stronger. I have a toddler right now who's building all of his fine motor skills, so I'm just like watching him figure out like just how to move his fingers and like exist in space and manipulate basic objects, and finding language for that is really hard, but it's kind of amazing to like see him like take a peg and try it to get it in the hole several different ways. Okay, now I've totally switched what I'm doing without even telling you about it. So the whole bottom part of this bowl, probably about 1/4 of an inch thick. The rim, still like 1/2 inch or more. So because but I don't want to go out anymore. So instead of pressing from the inside outwards, I'm going to use my fingers on the outside and try to bring the clay up, to make the second sort of like part of the torso. Because with a basic sort of round shape like this at the bottom, you can have like what you might call like the tire around your midsection that some people get. You get your hip, your belly, the beginning of your butt. Like that basic shape is all sort of one mass to start with. And then I add folds and detail later on in the process, which you'll see. But right now we're just sort of pressing. And we're ready to go up. So I'm going to switch from working primarily from the inside out, and I'm going to work from the outside in and up, sort of pinching together rather than pressing out as I go upwards to keep it smaller on the top than on the bottom. I don't know how well people can see what I'm doing, but just gently working the clay a little bit at a time. Trying to be responsive. And like, as I go, I felt like, oh, it's a little bit thick here. So I can still slip my hands under and make some more space. A little bit of smoothing, a little bit of pressure. All right, up we go. And then back to pinch, pinch, pinch. Pinch, pinch, pinch. All right. So now you can see we have the basic form of one of these pots, if you compare it to this one. Got the same basic shape, right? This one has a lot more sort of like detail in the folds and stuff. That is easier to add sort of later on in the process. I might even set this one aside and make it one of a different shape and just let it dry for even 20 minutes can help just sort of firm it up a little bit, so that when you start trying to alter the shape of the piece, it has a little bit more integrity to the structure. All right. So there we go. Nice little pinch pot, bud vase, whatever you want to call it. Let's do one a little bit bigger this time. So I'm going to take 1/2 of this body of clay. And so usually the rims of these pieces are made with coils at the very end, which I may or may not be able to show you, but just to sort of like add that final finesse and piece of detail. All right, so we're going to chop this in half. I'm going to stand up again to wedge it. All right, slightly larger piece of clay, maybe about 50% to twice as big, probably twice as big. This is quite a big piece of clay now that I'm feeling it. But again, sort of just giving it that final wedge in two directions to get it into a nice cylinder, make the clay feel nice and workable, happy, ready to go. I use a lot of different clay bodies in my work because I try to get a range of tones, skin tones in the finished pieces. The one that I have the hardest time replicating like my own skin tone, like a base, sort of like a really pink, pale Caucasian tone. Because you start to put too much white clay into a piece, and then when I put the oxides and washes on the outside, which is how I get most of the outside, we'll have like a typical commercial glaze on the inside, and the outside are all washes from Georgie's. They're interactive, but I never put them under glaze, so they don't interact with anything. They just bond to the clay. And they allow me to sort of be painterly with it and get a lot of detail into the finished piece, but I only have a few colors to work with. So I think eventually I'm going to have to learn how to use a mason stain and make myself a peach clay to start with, if I'm ever going to really get a good white people skin tone. I mean, I can get pretty pale, but not quite all the way to that color. It's a challenge. The things that you never realize will be hard, really just depending on your materials. So, all right, cylinder again, twice as big, heavier. Same process, just got to be more patient. In goes the thumb. Ugh. So usually, got stuck in there. With pinch pots, you are somewhat limited to the size of your hands, because like, at least for the initial forming, because I can't really work much more than this clay with both of my hands. So if I'm going to go, I'll get a little bit bigger than this with this particular pot, but if I'm going to go much larger than that, then I have to construct it in a different way. Usually that involves starting a basic form with slabs if I'm in the studio. That's an easy way, especially if I'm going quite large, to get started. Or if I'm going to do a sort of more medium-sized one, like that one, I will coil the initial forms. And then the limbs are all constructed separately. They're hollow as well. So, like, each part of that leg is like a mini pinch pot, shaped to the right size, and then sort of like flipped and scored and added onto one another and reshaped as it goes. That is also a process that has a lot of failure. So as I was talking about that, I just opened up this guy. Still quite thick. This one's going to be taller because it's a big piece of clay. So I think we might just like try to make a basic form with it first. More water. Slower, slower, slower. And again, you don't want to be too quick or forceful. You can't force an inch thick clay to become a 1/4 inch thick immediately. You have to just sort of slowly stretch it and let it form into its shape as you go. All right. So I'm pulling upwards and outwards here. I think this guy I'm just going to like make a form and set it aside, because it's a lot of clay, so it'll need some time to really firm up and be dry. But the nice thing about this process, and what I often do, is work in batches. So I'll start 5 or 6 at the same time, and then by the time I'm sort of done doing the first shaping of the last piece, the first piece that I shaped might be ready to work with, or I can get them all through the first stage, wrap them up in plastic, and most often come to them a couple days later, when they're just like really settled in. So slowly, slowly, just like making this thinner around the bottom. The base is quite thick, I can feel, so I'm going to push a little bit harder there. Oh, nice to look into the gallery behind everyone there. So many beautiful sculptures and pots. So I can feel that we're getting thinner around the bottom. And sort of like, I feel thicker spots and thinner spots, so shape my pressure accordingly. Okay. So now the bottom of that is thin, and then the top of this is thick as before, and we'll keep going upwards. So sometimes I can start to add some of those initial curves at this point. So we'll sort of pinch the waist in a bit here. You can see, and then these can become breast forms later on, or a back roll or a belly roll, probably. Just get the first indication of that shape, and then again, pinching and bringing in the tops together. And go add some more of those shapes later. All right. And this is going to be the back, I've now decided. So careful. We'll need to have a little butt crack. And like the clay is so malleable at this point, you don't need to do much to shape it. This is going to be the inner part. There we go. And I've sort of learned as I've been doing this, like, where do bodies generally dip in? Where do they push out? Everyone's different. So, like, the nice thing is, like, bodies come in so many different shapes and sizes and forms that you can really just, like, experiment and play a lot of times and just, like, let the form be. I'm not usually going for verisimilitude or likeness or, like, realism is not the goal. I want a sense of weight. I want a sense of sort of a satisfactory form, something to hold, and I want there to be a specificity to the form. So I want people to be able to look at that and say, "Oh, there's a fold or a freckle or a stretch mark or like some kind of shape that they can recognize, even if the whole form isn't like, oh, that looks like me or someone I know." You know what I mean? Although often I do get people come up to me being like, "Oh, that's me." Which elicits a variety of reactions in people, as people feel lots of different ways about their bodies. But I generally feel very positive about bodies of all shapes and sizes, but particularly fat and soft. I love the way flesh sort of lumps and slumps together, and clay really gives you an ability to get that weightiness, that sort of sense of gravity if you let it. I'm impressed with people who like throw and can make beautiful, big, airy, light pots that look like they can float. But my work all has like sits there on the table. Not the same thing. But clay can do both, which is a miracle, right? Like, amazing malleable material. It's also really nice when you're working with body forms, just to think about, and especially because these are always planters, that clay is dirt, really. And like, I like that sort of elemental feel to it. And it makes sort of a sense to me when I wind up putting more dirt in it and a succulent or a house plant or an herb or whatever. Or even if you fill it with water and use them as vases, which you can do. All right. So I have, as you can see, been working but not talking as much about what I've been doing, but working, which is typical. I tend to be very intuitive when I'm working. So like sometimes when I'm doing all of a sudden, like, hey, look, it's form, it's there. Like a few minutes ago, I didn't know what it was going to look like, and now its basic shape is pretty much established. You've got your basic inner parts, and like there's a lot of refining to be done. There are actual folds to be added and wrinkles, and then the breasts will, if there's going to have a breast in this one, if there will be breast forms, those will be added later as well. But this is getting to the point where I really need to stop touching it, or else I'm going to destroy it. So we'll set that over here, and we can return to this one. So I'm going to want to make that a little bit more like, less of just like, oh, this is a vase. Since I didn't have sort of a moment of inspiration like with that one, where the clay sometimes it's like, oh, I'm thicker on this side, I want to be a bulge of a belly, and I'm thinner on this side, I want to be the small of your back, which it often does. I'll have to go through and sort of like establish where do I want the basic contours of the form to be. So I think this one's going to have a nice big butt. So round form there, basic split. People's bellies tend to hang over in rolls. So I'm just sort of like establishing, okay, how is this going to move? And because I'm trained as a two-dimensional artist, like thinking about forms in terms of line and like drawing is more natural to me, I think, than thinking of it in 3 dimensions necessarily. But as you can see, I just drew that in, and then where the butt on the other side, you've got your belly button. So I just press that in. That'll help me establish the basic contours here. Why don't I move that over here where it will be less troubling? Okay. Now people can see what I'm doing. So to sort of add these folds, I'm going to stick my finger where I want it to go in and then push out on top. Just pinch in, push out. Okay, and then this small of the back goes in and down. Sort of just pinching and smoothing around. All right. There we go. Okay, there's a lot of, so now I'm also responding to it because there's a lot of clay right here. So that lump is going to be bigger than the bottom lump, which is fine. It'll just be a little lopsided, which is lovely. So now I've again stuck my fingers in here. During this part of the process, the rim tends to get really messed up. Don't worry about it too much because, as I said, I go back afterwards at the end with coils to finesse it. So like that's the last stage of things to get finished is the rim. And it took me a long time to sort of figure out different solutions that I liked for it. You know, for a long time, it was just sort of like a basic little circle, like tried to make it as smooth as possible. But because it's hand built, you can't make, it's really pretty impossible to make that like perfectly even, like smooth rim that you get when you're throwing. So I decided that like I also wanted there to be some more of a, wanted it to feel more intentional. So I started experimenting with different forms for the rim. These big swoopy things sort of came about as sort of a transition between like what a leaf shape might be and the body form. And I think about that often when I'm building a rim is like, how can I evoke some of the form of the plant that might be in there at the end? But sometimes when I put the plants in, then I go for contrast anyway and put like a spiky plant in a smooth rim thing. All right, so gone, and I've established most of that first fold. The other part that's tricky is this really sort of rounding out the butt part. So holding that in my hand and then like just pushing gently from the inside. Stretch. I want to get my whole hand in there. There we go. Push out the bottom a bit. That helps just sort of give it a little bit more volume. So now we've got something that looks a little bit more like the form of one of my finished pieces. Again, like the one I showed you before, it doesn't have a lot of the actual sort of folded lines. I can add those in several different ways as I sort of build pieces. This is getting dry. All right. But. All right. Press out the belly some more. And there we go. Okay. Okie dokie. Okie dokie, okie dokie. So, bringing the sort of rim together again. The shape is developing, as you can see. And here I want there to be sort of an actual fold. So I can feel where it will be, the sort of edge in the middle. And then I've got these wonderful tools, silicone-tipped paintbrushes. You can find them at Georgie's or online or most art supply stores. They're good for smoothing, they're good for shaping, and they're really good for detail work. For me, I really need to be able to get into the edges and the folds and clean things up and define things with a shape that's smaller than my finger. So this is one of my favorite tools, and I found I really like the biggest size because its tip is pretty fine, but I have a million of them in different sizes and shapes. So if I were to just say, okay, I want to define this line now, I'm going to, where the basic forms meet, and I'm pushing just gently all the way up, sort of like as the fat would fall against the body. And then here too, pushing in where that fold is going to be. Okay. Those look pretty rough and messy. Then I'm going to take them in and reinforce them by sort of like using my fingers on the inside to pinch it together along the fold. So if I can show that to you, go run my finger along the top of it like that, and that'll define it. And push sort of down, and then go underneath and push up. I don't really know how to describe it better than that. You just sort of have to feel it. It's such a tactile process. And like by the time I'm done with one of these things, one of these fat babes, I've just touched it all over so many times in so many ways. It's been like worked and worked and worked. Kind of amazing. Okay. All right. Smooth up my surface there. So that's beginning to look a little bit better in terms of like how the fold might be. This is the part that like takes a lot of refining, and when it often is best to wait for a little while so I can go back in once it's sort of firmed up and I'm not risking tearing a hole in the crease. Just something that happens a lot. Okay. Just sort of right now I'm just sort of going through and looking for weak spots on the inside, which is almost always going to be wherever I want there to be a fold or a weight. So I just sort of like I often fold over some excess clay on the inside from like when I'm pinching things together towards whichever part feels thinner or weakest, and that can sort of help bring the whole piece together. And now I'm just pinching the rim together, basically not to try and finish it, but just to help hold the structure of the piece because I'm going to put it aside to sit for a while. All right. Pinch, pinch, pinch and smooth. So, there. And that was not too long. I turned what was just like a little bud vase shape into something that's much more body. It's got a belly, it's got a back. The details have not all been refined yet, but the basic forms are all in there. So, that's pretty good. Leave that aside for now. Well, I think I may actually, let's do the rim on this one. I can finish up the details on it after the rim is finished. So I'm going to add a little bit of water to the where I'm going to add more clay. I don't want to score and slip because the coil I'm going to add is going to be about the same dampness as the clay body itself. I try to avoid adding too much water while I'm building if I can, and slip is a lot of water. So I tend to only use slip when I'm building if I have something that's like quite dry, leather hard, has been sitting for a week or more, and then I'm putting wet clay onto that, then I will slip where the wet clay is joining the drier clay. I don't, but when you're working, like when I just coil to build a shape, or when I'm working like this, this is twice as much. I don't need a lot of coil. Don't need a lot of clay for this coil. I'm not gonna use slip. I didn't even bring my slip today, so I can't score and slip. None of that can be done. So to roll a coil, some people do this and they like make the most beautiful, like perfect, smooth, long snakes. Mine are never that perfect. But they are even enough that I can work with them. So I just start by basically squeezing out a lump. We'll be generous and call it a lump and not what else it looks like. And then starting lightly and big motions. I think that's the key. If you want big motions and frequently picking it up and moving it. So that you don't get, but even so, my coils get flat quickly. So then I just have to sort of move them around again and if the outside gets little dimples, the outside gets little dimples. All right. Now this is getting too wide for my work surface. I'll cut it in half. Reasonably even, about twice as thick as I want it. So, and then it's best, I usually start from the middle when I'm coiling, and I use pressure as I go down. Try to keep it even through my fingers. Start from the middle of the coil and move outwards as a general rule, but I don't. Again, it's something that's just very intuitive. I mean, y'all been making, Play-Doh snakes since you were my toddler's age, probably. So, like, it's not any different than that to get it. Although, like anything, it's easy to learn and difficult to master, to get it, like, to the point where you're going to use a coil to, like, build something decorative with it. That impresses me. But ultimately, all of this is going to get smoothed out and worked out with my fingers anyway. So if there are little imperfections, which as you can see, there are lots of little imperfections, doesn't matter. This is probably enough for me to get going. So I've got my basic form. I want to build up a rim. The rim's going to go out, I think, because that'll suit this shape to have it go out and forward a bit, give it some balance. So we'll start. I usually sort of pinch it in on the inside. Instead of going down, I'm just sort of like bringing the outside clay up and the inside clay down, like opposite one another, if that makes sense. At least for this first round. And I don't fully bind or smooth it until I've added the whole coil, 2 or 3 layers up. Now, I broke that off there. That's our start. At this point, I think I will bring it together because I want to just give myself a real nice base to bring the clay forward. So I'll start by pulling up on the outside, and it is good to go both directions if you can, at least on opposite sides of versus the inside versus the outside. If you're sort of pushing down on the inside, you want to pull up on the outside. Helps it bind. But I tend to try and go down first and then up a little bit. It's again, just all very sort of instinctual, smooth little bits of clay as we go. So I'm pushing down and then up a little bit. More pressure as I go down with my thumb, less as I come up to smooth. So the downward stroke is joining the pieces, and the upward stroke is smoothing them. All right. All around we go. All right. That is basically bonded on the inside. So now I'm going to add the rest of the snake here. But I don't think I want the back to come up much higher than this, so I'm going to focus on adding the clay to the front. So I'll bring it around and then out to the outside because we're going to want this to go out and then clip, smoosh. And then again, a little bit further to the outside. And there. And then looking at that, it's a little bit uneven. So, last piece there. There you can see the basic shape the rim's going to have. And then I'm going to bring it down and in because you can see I'm supporting it in the shape I want it to be and then using my thumb to press the rim in. And I think the key is with this, because I'm not scoring and slipping, you do need to work the clay pretty heavily with your fingers, like a lot of pinching, a lot of smoothing, a lot of patience. So pushing down, bringing all of these little coils together into one body of clay. All right, we'll go down then from this way. Maybe I'll use my other hand so you can see again. Okay. So there's a little line here where it didn't want to get smooshed down, so I'll pinch. All right. That's the outside basically done. Now I will bring my finger around and do some basic smoothing, and sort of a pressure from a different direction helps to make sure that all those pieces are really well joined on this surface. There we go. And because this clay has the sculptural clay in it, it's drying out faster than got the gritty clay in it, so it's really like it'll have more tendency to crack than a more plastic clay would. If I were using the dark chocolate on its own, I probably wouldn't be having as much sort of little bits of cracks here and there, but it can be quickly brought together. Because like I said, it's all sort of about one same level of dampness. All right. And now on the inside, I'm going down and up, as I said again, to bring it together. But again, supporting the basic curvature with my hand on the outside. You got to always make sure when you're hand building that you're giving it support from both directions, or at least as much as possible, until the piece is more like leather hard. Then you can sort of depend on the structure of the clay to hold up against you. But when it's wet, there's just like, it needs the support of your hand behind it as you're working. Otherwise, it's just going to lump into some sort of shape that you don't recognize, or you'll tear a hole. Okay. There we go. Almost all done. So, there we go. Now the rim is like basically one body of clay. I'm just pinching it to sort of make it all the same thickness. I will, when it's drier, I will take I will probably cut a little bit around the edge and smooth some more with my finger just to like give it that refined, like sharp finish that a lot of these has. And then when it's drier too, I will maybe add some breast forms or some nipples or something. But if I were to try to do that now, the piece would probably collapse. So, all right, leave this be. There you go. You can see how I got from here to there. Basically in, I don't know what time it is, but in however long it's been. Thank you. So those are the pinch pots. What, can you tell me what I have on time here? 18 minutes. Cool. So I will, why don't we do a little bit of, Q&A. You can do that. And while you do that, I'm going to like just play and throw some slabs and stuff. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. So I don't do any underglazing or anything like that. Once things are all done being sculpted, they get bisqued, and then the glazing is a multi-step process. So, first I wash and sand like you usually do, if there are any, especially when there are a little bit of carving where there might be some hair or whatever. There's sometimes some roughness, so a little bit of filing or sanding there is helpful. And then the next step is usually to wax. And I don't wax the bottoms because the oxides don't really stick to the kiln, but I do use the wax decoratively, so all the stretch marks are just the painted wax resist. So if you look at the color of a stretch mark, that is the color of the clay body fired on its own. And so I think this one was Toast and Sculptural. You can see it's got sort of, which is another one of the Georgie's trail mix clays that I like all of them. Toast, cinnamon, dark chocolate, great clays across the board. So then I wax with a paintbrush. Then I usually pour the inner glaze, and I just use a bunch of different commercial glazes. I don't know how to mix my own. And that's my next project actually is test tiles, because I have so many glazes. I don't know if any of y'all ceramicists have this problem where you go to Georgie's and you're like, ooh, that looks fun. I'm going to use this and use it for one piece. And you're like, what does it look like? Should I use it again? I don't remember. So I use the inner glazes. I like red and blue glazes is what I've discovered. And I like them when they have some depth to the body, and I'm always trying to make a contrast between the inside of the pot with the sort of usually a glossy or some other kind of glaze, like textural effect glaze, and then the outside of the pot, which is usually always this sort of consistent matte, sort of more skin tone, because I like to have that like feeling when you're looking at them that they do have that like body feeling, and like the shiny finish of a gloss glaze isn't going to give me that. So, and then the last couple steps involve the interactive washes I was talking about before from Georgie's. They come in a few different colors. I've got like a golden yellow and a sandy yellowish brown, and then a few different browns that run red or sort of more cool brown. And I apply those on the outside, usually with sponges to start, and watered down by about half. So I'm using them really like washes. And then it's a lot of like, apply the wash, I'll like, maybe with a brush, I'll apply the darker wash to the hair first, and then wipe that off, and then tap, 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 at least one color, usually two different colors of washes. Then I paint the nipples on with one of the watered down washes that has sort of a red cast to it. And then do some flicking for freckles and moles and stuff. So you have that sort of texture to it as well. And then fire it. And then this is what they look like. And I'm pretty happy with the finishes as the usual rule. At least the outside ones, I seem to have be able to get consistent results, and that's good. So, and what I'm just doing now is, poor man's slab. Thank you. So a bigger piece I might start, before I had a studio and access to a slab roller, just whack them out and then flap. And with a little bit of down towards you, and that sort of brings all the clay particles together and helps them sort of settle and mix. Yeah. And then look at that. Beautiful slab. I could just take that and start a larger piece. Just pinch up the sides, usually is what I would do. And then I would coil to go up for one of these bigger pieces. Like that one would probably start like this. And then coil and build until it's about where I want it to be. As I was doing before. I don't think I'm going to do that right now because we're running out of time, but that's another. So I showed you the pinch pot, that's the basic. But it's the same basic process in terms of building, going slowly, really relying on the intuition of your hands to tell how thick things are, and really working the clay from both sides. And that just in general, I don't have problems with things like cracking or falling apart. Not that it never happens, but Usually it's pretty good. Any other questions before I wrap up? Yeah, all right. Thank you all very much.